Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to the Inside Scoop. I'm Jeff Barnett. Tonight we're going to be talking about national security, national defense, and more specifically about the future of the United States Air Force. So we'll be talking with Lieutenant General Dave Deptula. And General, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. Great to be here.
General Deptula, if you're a leader within the defense establishment, you've heard his name. If you're in the Air Force at all, you certainly know his name. He was the attack planner during Operation Desert Storm in Kuwait back in 1991. Became the Air Force A2 in charge of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So in essence, spies, space, and drones. So let's get right into this, and let's first talk about drones, a hot topic these days. Washington Post this weekend came out with a very favorable article or op-ed about drones, but in essence what they were saying is like it's kind of the lesser of many evils. What do you tell people about the efficacy and the accuracy and the role that drones have in protecting America?
Well, thanks for the question, Jeff. First thing I would zero in on is terminology, because part of what has set up some of the misperceptions that exist out in the public about what the media likes to call drones is a term itself. Because as you know, being a former Air Force officer, the term drone in military parlance really refers to a target that we use for target practice in the air. But in the public space, right, it carries a connotation of a degree of autonomy and independent action that simply does not exist. That's why we initiated the use of the term remotely piloted aircraft in the Air Force that basically much better describes what these things really are, because they are piloted by a human. It's just that human's not co-located with that little piece of fiberglass flying around in the sky. Now, with respect to the capabilities of remotely piloted aircraft or drones or unmanned aerial vehicles, that actually describes what they are. They're unmanned aerial vehicles, but they have a huge number of people associated with them. A lot of people, and I dare say your audience probably doesn't know, that it takes approximately 200 people to maintain a single orbit, or what in the Air Force we call combat air patrol.
Now, those 200 people, are they mostly in the area where the drone is operating, or are they mostly back in the United States?
This is one of the advantages of drone operations, in that the majority of those people are 7,000 miles away from the operation. And the majority of those people are analysts who assimilate the information that's provided by the sensor carried by the drone. That's what gives drones and makes them, number one of the most precise means of force application in the entire military inventory. Because you have a whole arsenal of people who are observing what's going on so they can develop the information and knowledge about the area of interest before they decide to employ weapons. Mm-hmm. Number two, they're very precise because the munitions that are carried on board the aircraft generally have an area of less than 9 feet when they impact something.
So 9 feet, that's about twice the distance between the two of us.
Right, right.
I mean, and the missile itself has got to be a certain size anyway, so that's right. That's extraordinary.
It is, particularly in the context of, you look at the average miss distance of a 155 millimeter howitzer, an artillery piece, which is about 1,000 feet relative to 9 feet. Or the most accurate mortar, which is about 300 feet compared to 9 feet.
Or the bomb in World War II that was
3,000 feet. So there's this great disparity between the reality of the precision of these weapon systems, the drones, in the public mindset. Part of that is because every single second of those unmanned aerial vehicle operations are filmed. Imagine if you filmed every artillery round, every mortar round, every 1 ounce lead projectile fired by a young man or woman engaged in combat, and where they went. But
how many drones are we talking about?
The ones that get the attention, the ones that the MQ-1 Predator and the MQ-9 Reaper, we have a total of about 300, just over 300.
And is that
total.
all in the Air Force?
Those aircraft are all in the Air Force, except there is a remotely piloted aircraft very similar to the MQ-1 Predator called the Gray Eagle that the Army has begun to acquire. And there are just under 100 of those.
Doesn't the CIA control some of these airplanes?
Yes, the CIA does. And now we're getting into an issue that has also been discussed in the press, and that is the use of these aircraft for covert, what are known as Title 50 operations versus pure military or Title 10 operations. A completely different subject, but it's one that's related, and you hear about a lot of it in the press. There's many people, again, misperception is, geez, we have to shift completely the use of these systems out of Title 50 CIA operations over to military operations, with the misperception that somehow there's going to be more transparency. Well, in actuality, there's more oversight by the Congress with Title 50 operations of these systems than there are when they're operated by the Department of Defense personnel. But I digress, because...
Give me an idea, though, when let's say a Reaper operator pulls the trigger, how many people are in that decision matrix, that decision line, before he or she pulls that trigger?
It's a good question, but there's not a pat answer, because it's very situational dependent. It depends upon, is this a high-value target individual? Is it someone or is it a target of interest that's been watched for 2-3 weeks? Or is it in the midst of a conflict where you're providing close air support to troops in contact and you need to engage immediately? So it depends is the right answer. But one of the things I wanted to get across to you and your audience is there's been so much mythology and, quite frankly, propaganda that has been placed into the environment regarding the accuracy of remotely piloted aircraft. The fact of the matter is, these are the most precise means of employing force at a distance with the greatest degree of ethical oversight of any weapon system that we have, which goes back to the fact that you can loiter for a long period of time. You have multiple analysts watching what's going on before a decision is made, going back to your question in terms of who's in the decision loop. And if there's any question about the situation, you bring in additional experts and you don't engage. A lot of folks have said, well, what about all the civilian casualties?
Right.
Well, don't listen to me, but let's take a look at what the United Nations Security Assistance Mission to Afghanistan has to say about this subject. Every year they publish a report on the number of civilian casualties that have occurred in Afghanistan. The number of civilian casualties attributable to unmanned aerial vehicles or drones is less than 1%.
1% of
all the civilian casualties that's killed or injured in Afghanistan. And that's generally been the trend for the last 3 years. See, the vast majority of civilian casualties, deaths, and injuries have been the result of terrorist, intentional, and Taliban acts against the local populace. The difference in perception is our adversaries, Al-Qaeda, other terrorist groups, Taliban, cannot directly stop these remotely piloted drone operations. So what they do is they try to influence the perceptions and manipulate the perceptions of the public to try to get us to do what they can't, and that is to reduce the operations of these very highly effective tools that we have in our arsenal to combat terrorism.
Okay, let's talk about how effective they are. And let's use, let's say, ISIL as an example. We are using both manned and unmanned aircraft. There are people on the ground of some nationalities. How is that war going? How effective are we being in not controlling ISIL, but in degrading them, I guess.
Well, to answer your question, and you'll hear me say this relative to many questions that are asked about what's going on with a particular conflict. Because often the discussion on TV and in the battle space, or in the discussion space, on news shows, in the newspaper, on the internet, focuses on tactics. You know, you hear people, talking heads, talk about, well, you got to have boots on the ground to win. You can't just do it with air power alone. You hear these different discussions, but they're focused on tactics. In the context of your question, how well are we doing? You know, my answer back, or question back, would be, how well we are doing what? What is it that you want to measure? Now, I understand what you're getting the gist of, but what I'm trying to do is, we have to look at what are the declared strategic objectives. And in the case of ISIL, the president has laid out the fact that his strategic level objectives are to degrade ISIL and then to destroy them. Okay, now that's a great strategic objective, but what you want to get to is, all right, how are we doing in terms of getting there? Well, then one has to get to the operational level goals and objectives that get us to the strategy. And I would suggest to you that there are three. One, we have to halt ISIL's ability to expand its operations. Two, we need to conduct operations that paralyze its leadership and command and control and ability to control our forces to continue to spread their evil and criminal actions. And then three, we need to take actions that basically render ISIL as an effective force completely ineffective.
And do you think that's a doable?
I think all three of those are doable in terms of operational objectives, but there will be a mixing and matching of different types of forces provided by different service components and from different nations in accomplishing each of them.
I'm Jeff Barnett. We're here talking with General Dave Deptula. Next, we're going to talk about Syria and Iran. Back in 2 minutes. Oh, I'm sorry. I took the wrong cue here. Actually, what you were talking about is kind of a reference to General Powell's dictum of 25 years ago. First, we're going to cut him off, and then we're going to kill him.
Art, a universal language,
I thought you said
an expression of
10 seconds.
culture, of self. And now, thanks to Empowered Women International, a way for emerging and established immigrant and refugee artists and artisans
What's this?
to find hope to earn a living while enriching the lives of all of us. Empowered
we on
Women
commercial now?
International, making a better America every day. For more information on Empowered Women International's educational programs, or to make a tax-free donation, contact cfrip at AOL.com.
Here, kitty, kitty. Here, kitty, kitty, kitty. Here, kitty, kitty.
You'd think it would be easy to tell which kids have trouble with their eyesight. But that's not always the case. Even though 1 in 4 children may have a vision problem, eye doctors tell us the symptoms aren't always so obvious. We do know that 80% of all childhood learning is visual. And without good vision, kids can have trouble learning to read and may fall behind in school. For clues on how to spot the real-life signs of childhood vision problems and what parents can do, visit checkyearly.com. A public service message from the Vision Council of America and Reading is Fundamental.
We're Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Hi, welcome back. I'm Jeff Barnett. We're talking with retired Lieutenant General Dave Deptula, who's the Dean of the Mitchell Institute of the Air Force Association, and we were just talking about ISIL. Why don't we complete that a little bit?
Sure.
Pull out, you were about to talk about...
Yeah, you were asking about how we're doing in the context of, and I added the context of our objectives. Laid out the operational level objectives, one of which is halting ISIL's additional movement forward. And we have some pretty concrete proof, but that we're doing pretty well in that regard. If you take a look at where ISIL was at in September, the fact that without the application of modern air power, they own the Mosul Dam area. After we introduced our asymmetric advantage, in conjunction with indigenous surface forces, right. Friendly forces now occupy.
Which is kind of the same model as Afghanistan.
It was exactly that model, Jeff, and that's very astute. Kobani, you remember we thought, oh my gosh, air power's not going to be able to do this alone. Well, operating in conjunction with indigenous forces on the ground. Now Kobani's in friendly hands. We just saw what happened in Tikrit. Surface forces alone could not oust the ISIL forces. U.S. intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets and precision engagement. Our airmen, young men and women, have been done a magnificent job in very precisely guiding munitions in accordance with good information, and Tikrit fell to the Iraqi security forces. So we're doing very well in the context of halting ISIL's further movement. I would suggest to you that we could be doing more in terms of paralyzing their ability to operate. To give you some context for the amount of force that's being used over there, since September 22nd, when we first started launching sorties into Syria, we've averaged about 7 to 8 strike sorties per day. During Operation Desert Storm, the first Iraq war to halt Saddam's aggression, we launched on the average of 1,140 strike sorties per day. So we did in 2 days in Desert Storm what we've done in 6 months against ISIL. And I'm not suggesting that we use that kind of amount of force, but if we increase the intensity, for example, halting traffic between the capital of ISIL in Raqqa, Syria, and Mosul, we could continue to put hurt on those operational level objectives that ultimately support the President's objectives of halting and then defeating ISIL.
Let's kind of use that same kind of a template and move over just a little bit to the west and talk about Syria. Are we doing a similar effort in Syria today?
Well, actually, my comments involve Syria. Raqqa is in the middle of Syria. That's where ISIL's operating out of.
But against the regime in Syria.
Okay, now you're talking about in the context of Assad. Now, Syria is an extremely complex case, as you're well aware. I mean, we've got disparate elements of different terrorist group, some Sunni, some Shia, some supported by Iran, others supported by disparate elements around the globe. The Kurds are involved. Assad has perpetrated crimes against his own people. So it's a very, very complex set of issues. And there's not yet been a very clearly delineated coalition strategy because you have all these disparate groups out there. What I would suggest to you is U.S. strategy needs to center on 2 pieces. One, ISIL needs to be eliminated. That's a critical U.S. national security interest. The second element of recommended strategy in Syria would be to drive a wedge between that small group that still props up Assad and those that are wavering but that still support him. And we do that by supporting the moderate rebels to drive a wedge between those groups and then form a new government that is much more benevolent to all the different sects that reside in Syria.
And you think, or you think it's possible that that same template of American air power, precision air power, kind of led by drones, in concert with indigenous forces on the ground is a war-winning operational strategy.
It is in the case of ISIL. I mean, we got to be careful with ISIL and remember that there's not a line on the ground between Syria and Iraq. ISIL has declared a caliphate that exists between those two states. So a critical U.S. national security interest is to eliminate ISIL as an effective force. We cannot allow a terrorist state to grow. With respect to Syria, it's less well defined in terms of, okay, what are the critical U.S. national security interests? Because in fact, you have two groups that oppose U.S. security interests fighting against each other. So there are a lot of nuances in the context of what's the appropriate strategy to follow with Syria.
Right.
But in either case, we should not introduce large numbers, of any numbers for that matter, of combat U.S. forces on the ground. We ran down that rabbit hole in both Iraq and Afghanistan and found to our detriment that that did not help in securing U.S. national security interest. It actually hindered achieving U.S. national security interest. So I do agree with you that the model that ought to be followed is the one that was so successful in the first 2 months of Operation Enduring Freedom, taking us back to Afghanistan. By the 31st of December of 2001, we had removed the Taliban regime. A government friendly to coalition countries was in place, and we eliminated the Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps, all by the 31st of December 2001. Where an error was made from a strategic perspective is in introducing hundreds of thousands of boots on the ground to try to change a collection of 14th century tribes into a modern Jeffersonian democracy. That's unobtainium. And quite frankly, not critical to U.S. national security interests.
Yeah. Interestingly, the same model was used long before Desert Storm in 1991. It was used in the Easter Offensive in Vietnam in 1973 when Giap attacked with 200,000 guys and there were no U.S. ground combat forces. There was logistics on the ground at the time, but the combination of American air power plus South Vietnamese land forces resulted in a resounding defeat of the North Vietnamese army, and General Giap was fired, the hero of Dien Bien Phu. That's kind of interesting questions that are kind of coming up here, and we have about, we have 5 minutes before the first break. We have plenty of time. Let's talk about force structure. There was a General Welch, the Air Force Chief of Staff, testified to the Senate Armed Services Committee the other day. If you excuse me, I'd like to read something. He said, "We now have the smallest Air Force that there's ever been." So that'd be since 1947. In Air Force, in Operation Desert Storm, so the Kuwait operation, the Air Force had 188 fighter squadrons in those days. Today, the Air Force has 54. So 188 to 54, and is going down to 49. Now, you were the chief attack planner. You were in the Black Hole in Operation Desert Storm. Could we have pulled off that fight with those goals in that situation with today's force structure?
You give a military planner a problem, and he or she is going to do their best to make it happen. It's a bit of a hypothetical, but it would be very difficult, because we would not have the same degree of flexibility. The other thing that occurs when you constrict the forces to such a small number is, you might have been able to pull off what we did in Desert Storm in that location, but what you're doing is now you're taking forces away from
Korea,
their presence in the rest of the world, which then encourages adventurism in those parts of the world that they're no longer there. And the impact in terms of moving those forces on the support forces amplifies the challenge, which gets to the heart of our force sizing mechanism, which gets back to the issue of strategy. National security strategy. What does the American people expect of its military? And the fact of the matter is, if in fact during peacetime they want us to shape and assure stability and peace around the world, we have to have sufficient force structure to do that. And then if we're forced to fight somewhere, we need to have sufficient numbers of forces to be able to fight. And I would suggest to you, international military strategies, verified over several quadrennial defense reviews, is that we have to have more than just to be able to fight and win one conflict, to be able to deter others. So we need to have sufficient numbers of force structure to simultaneously deal with multiple conflicts.
But if we're talking about the current budget, even if you take out the war operations, it's over $600 billion. Now, why can't we buy enough Air Force, enough force structure, when we're putting up $600 billion a year for defense?
Well, that'd be great if you gave the Air Force $600 billion, if you made that part of our force, our budget. But the fact of the matter is the United States Air Force has lost budget structure over the last decade, and we are now funded the smallest of all of the services, with less than 1/5 of the defense budget. Meanwhile, we have...
So it's not 1/3, 1/3, 1/3.
No, it's not 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. It is Air Force 1/5, and the rest is distributed amongst the other services and Department of Defense agencies. Meanwhile, we have a geriatric Air Force. Not only are we smaller than any time since 1947, last year, 2014, the Air Force procured fewer number of aircraft than it has since 1915, which is before the Air Force was in service. 1915, 1-5.
Before World War I.
Right, 100 years ago. So we bought more aircraft than we did last year. Meanwhile, we have a geriatric Air Force. We have fighters that are on average 30 years. We have trainers and helicopters that are 40 years, and we have bombers that are over 50 years old. I'll give you a stat that General Welch uses frequently, and it's a good one. If we were flying B-17s that we used in World War II over Baghdad, they would be younger than the B-52s that we have flying today. So I hope that gives your audience a bit of perspective in terms of just how old our Air Force is.
We have about 30 seconds. Your son is now flying for the Air Force, right?
Yes, sir.
Flying F-22s. And how many deployments has he had?
Well, he's relatively new in that aircraft, but he's had several deployments.
Well, I'm Jeff Barnett. I'm here talking with General David Deptula. We're going to come back, and next thing is we're going to take on is sequestration. Back in 2 minutes.
This is firstgov.gov, where we're obsessed with getting you government information.
Brand new student loan applications on the site, baby. This calls for a celebration.
We'll talk about that next.
So in the end, it was either take the astronaut gig or come work here. What can I say? Duty called.
Dude, that's my cop.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that's Sam's cop.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No. Sam's. No.
Just log on or email us and get what you need.
C, change of address form. That's how it's done.
D, driver's license renewal.
E, emailing social security information.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Nice, we'll allow it. All right, What are those?
Government surplus cars for auction.
You posted those online last time.
No, you did.
I'm posting them online this time!
For all your government information, firstgov.gov.
Oh, what have we got here? Sometimes you feel tired. You can't seem to lose those extra pounds off your midsection. And your joints hurt when you take the stairs. Well, you're getting older. But I'm happy to say that there's some simple things we can do to keep you happy and healthy for years to come. We can also lower your risk for some serious diseases the older population is often subject to. Proper nutrition is more important than ever. Your body has changed, you know. Not as many treats. A basic exercise plan, lots of walks and fresh air, and most importantly, come and see me for twice-yearly checkups to help ensure the best possible quality of life. Now, how does that sound? Good boy.
Improve the quality of life for your elderly pet. Schedule twice-yearly checkups that include preventive care and regular lab work. A message from the veterinary members of the American Animal Hospital Association.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back. I'm Jeff Barnett, and we're getting the inside scoop on the future of the U.S. military, specifically focused on the Air Force, but really the military writ large. And we're here with General Dave Deptula, retired Air Force fighter pilot, flew the F-15. Matter of fact, you flew the F-15 just before you retired, didn't you?
5 days before my official retirement ceremony, I flew a front seat sortie in the F-15.
That must have been fun.
Yeah, I've flown the F-15 since 1977, 77 to 2010, and rechecked out in it 6 times. And I was very proud of the fact that I was fully mission capable as a 3-star general. So what that means is I could go out and fly with the captains in my single-seat aircraft and hold my own.
And one of those captains could have been your own son.
Actually, in 2008, I flew to Kadena Air Base, Japan. I was a 2-star general at the time, and the Air Force or the military won't let you fly in the same airplane, but I actually flew against him in a dogfight. And we were flying the same tail numbers that I had flown when I was a captain in 1979. So that was 29 years later, and here we are flying the exact same airplanes, except when I flew them as a captain, they only had about 20, 30 flight hours on them. When my son was flying them as a captain, they had about 7,000 hours on them. And this is one of the reasons why we need to recapitalize our force. You don't know what's going to go wrong with the airplane. 2 weeks after I left him, he's taxiing into the arming area and his nose wheel broke off. The next week he went up, he had an engine fire, and the next week he had an engine that got caught stuck in afterburner and he had to shut it down in order to land. So there are a lot of things that happen over time just because of the age of the force. This is one of the situations that we find ourselves with our bomber force.
What is the Air Force's position on buying a new bomber? We have 3 bombers right now, the B-52, the B-1, and the B-2.
Right.
And the Air Force is pushing for a new one.
That's right.
And what kind of, is it going to be a manned bomber?
Well, actually, it will be an optionally, there is a lot of the specifics about the aircraft have been kept undercover or classified. And there is some discussion about whether it should be optionally manned or just solely manned, or perhaps when you think about the kind of airplane that's going to be built, it's going to last for another 50 years. So one of the key design tenets is it needs to be modular. It needs to have evolution built into it. So that depends. But what's really important is the need for that bomber. Today we have currently less than 100 combat-coded bombers. I mentioned in the last segment that
we have lots more airplanes that can drop bombs. Like
we
the F-22
do, but not
bombs.
to the degree. The F-22 can drop 2 bombs. F-35 can drop 2 bombs. Doesn't mean that they're not used for other purposes. We have to be careful that we don't, just associate this metric with
drones.
Drones
can drop bombs.
Drones can drop bombs, but they can't fly the distance. They can't survive a competent enemy. And they cannot carry the payload, nor do they have the versatility that a long-range sensor shooter has. Because the terminology, again, is important, Jeff. When you use bomber, you conjure up images of those B-17s, B-24s, B-52s. But the next long-range sensor shooter is going to be a node inside a architecture that is a self-healing, self-forming combat cloud, if you will, that shares information, that has the ability to penetrate contested airspace and come back and inform the commander of what's going on. Plus, have the ability to carry large numbers of weapons. One B-1 can carry the equivalent. One B-1 sortie in northern Iraq recently could basically make up for 40 FNA-18EF sorties launched off of an aircraft carrier. So there's, when you talk about the advantages of a bomber, that's one of them. They can go long ranges, they can carry high payloads, they can loiter for a long period of time.
And those aircraft off the aircraft carrier, they would all have to hit a tanker.
Absolutely.
Which is land-based.
Right.
So there's nuclear weapons. We really haven't talked about that at all, but I would think that if you're building a new bomber, you have to have the flexibility to carry a nuclear weapon. And you really wouldn't want to put a nuclear weapon in a unmanned aircraft. So you're really driven towards a manned aircraft, aren't you?
Absolutely. You make an excellent point, because there are many people that I call, and I was the Air Force's greatest advocate for remotely piloted aircraft. But there are some folks who I call unconstrained enthusiasts that make statements like, we've seen the last of the manned aircraft, everything is going to be unmanned from now on. Well, not so fast, because from a policy perspective, even though you might be able to remote a particular system, you mentioned a good case. I don't think we're going to put a nuclear weapon on board an unmanned vehicle and say, see you later. Just like I don't think the next variant of Air Force One is going to be designed without a cockpit because it can operate autonomously. So there are policy and psychological issues involved in why we put human beings in the vehicles themselves. But there should be a balance. And there is a balance. That's the way the Air Force is force structuring for the future. And the other services are headed in that same direction too.
But part of that balance is cost. And the new F-35, I think we have a slide on that, but we're talking about $140 million per airplane. And I'm not sure if that's life cycle cost or if that's flyaway cost or what it is. But regardless, these airplanes are getting to the point where we're just not going to be able to afford an entire fleet of them like we had before. Those 188 squadrons worth of $140 million airplanes.
Yeah, we have to be careful though in terms of, actually your chart ends in 2012. I would tell you that the F-35, because of where it is in the production curve, that number is starting to go down. Okay. So we're looking at a target cost by the time the fleets run out of around $80 to $90 million a copy. Now, that sounds like a large number until you compare it to what has gone on in the past. And so we have to be careful that we don't use as a measure of merit absolutely unit cost of an aircraft. Let me take you back to World War II. Okay, in World War II, to eliminate one target, it took, because of the gross size of the error accuracy in dropping weapons, about 1,000 B-17s with 10 people each, so that's 10,000 people, 1,000 airplanes, and 10,000 bombs to destroy one target.
All right.
In Desert Storm, we used one F-117, which was our first stealth aircraft, first stealth fighter bomber, that carried 2 bombs that were so accurate that I could kill 2 targets with one airplane. Let me give you one other example. It's a very good one. Using conventional, non-stealthy aircraft, there was a particular target, a nuclear weapons site, nuclear reactor site south of Baghdad called Tuwaitha. The force package that we used to attack that consisted of 75 aircraft. You had to have 15 tankers, you had to have air-to-air aircraft, F-15s, to potentially ward off the enemy aircraft. You had
electronic
to have
warfare,
suppression of enemy air defense aircraft, electronic warfare, 75 aircraft, okay, to hit the specific number of desired mean points of impact on that weapons or that reactor facility. You could do that with one B-2. But people point to the B-2. I mean, Secretary Gates used to castigate it as being so expensive.
$2 billion.
Yeah, well, at the time, 95 flyaway unit cost $1.4 billion. But if you rack up all the cost of those individual aircraft in that force package, you end up with $7.5 billion. So, Jeff, which one's more expensive?
But then we get back to, is it an issue then when General Welsh talks about 188 squadrons back in Desert Storm versus heading towards 49 today, you're almost making the case that, well, it may not be 49, but that kind of a ballpark figure is sustainable given the increases in capability that you're talking about from these platforms.
You make an excellent point, and you're exactly right. There is a balance. Because of the increased capabilities of the aircraft that we have today, we don't need a one-for-one replacement. But I'm not looking to replace, we had over 3,000 bombers in the 1950s. Today we have less than 100. But all of the force structure numbers need to be driven not by cost per airplane, but what is the national security strategy? Let me take you back, if I may, and I really wanted to end up with this, but I'll insert it here because it makes sense. Everyone has a different perspective in terms of how much money should be allocated to defense, how much money should be allocated to Social Security, welfare, Medicaid. But I don't think many people argue or would argue with the preamble of the Constitution, which states that the reason that we have a government in the first place, quote, is to provide for the common defense, comma, promote the general welfare. It doesn't say provide for the general welfare and promote the common defense. So we have to go back to first principles, and this is a discussion that we still haven't had yet in the town of Washington, D.C., and that's priorities. Because we've had the luxury of operating in the last 25 years, the end of the Cold War, in relative peace. Yes, we've had conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, but guess what? They've been conflicts where we have owned the airspace. That hasn't been an issue. It's given our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who operate on the ground the freedom of movement.
And if they get in trouble, they can pull back. And
they don't even need to pull back. They can call air power to the rescue, which was done many, many, many times. But that force structure is getting old. So if we want to have that kind of capability in the future, we need to be willing to invest in it.
But the question is not whether or not we're going to invest in defense. The question is how much.
Right.
And there are people who are saying, look, the $660 billion a year right now is not enough. And then there are also people that are saying that DOD won't even get that amount of money because, and that's what we're going to talk about in our next section, sequestration is looming. And so there could be immense cuts coming to the Defense Department. We never thought we'd see sequestration, but then it seems to be rearing its ugly head. So then the question that I'd like to pull out when we get back to the break is, what do you see as the impacts, possible impacts of sequestration? I'm Jeff Barnett. We'll be right back in 2 minutes.
Some dreams are universal. Dreams that inspire us. Multiple sclerosis is a devastating disease that changes lives forever. The National MS Society does more for people with MS than any organization in the world. But we can't do it alone. To get involved, visit us online at nationalmssociety.org. or call 1-800-FIGHT-MS. This is why we're here. Because nobody dreams of having multiple sclerosis.
What's wrong with this picture? Half of young Americans can't locate economic powers like Japan and India. 20% can't even find the Pacific Ocean. Without geography, our children aren't ready for the world. Geography is everywhere. It's incredible creatures, rhythm, fashion, flavor. It's economics and politics. It's change. Understanding connections between people and places is critical in the 21st century.
That's why we created mywonderfulworld.org. Go there now for your free parent and teacher action kits and give our kids the power of global knowledge. Because kids who understand our world today can succeed in it tomorrow.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back. I'm Jeff Barnett, and we're having a fascinating conversation with Lieutenant General retired Dave Deptula, who is a graduate of Fairfax High School and of the University of Virginia. You've got both your bachelor's and your master's degrees there. How did a UVA degree help you in your Air Force career? How did that work?
That's an interesting question, because I have pondered that for a while, and I would tell you that my belief in terms of college education is when you go to undergraduate college, you work on your undergraduate degree, that basically teaches you how to learn, teaches you how to engage with the rest of the world, expands your horizons. But unless you're in a specialty like engineering or architecture, you really don't specialize. I got my undergraduate degree in astronomy because at the time I was growing up in the 60s and wanted to be an astronaut. But then when I went to flight school and I got a taste of flying high-performance jet aircraft, I asked myself, why would I want to be a bus driver? As opposed to flying
a nice bus,
as opposed to flying a Ferrari, which I joke with my good friend General Kevin Chilton all the time, who flew 3 space shuttle missions and a fighter. But when I went to graduate school, I went in the first program that the University of Virginia had in systems engineering. And systems engineering, when I look back on it, gave me a perspective to step back and look at a problem from an enterprise perspective, or from a top-down as opposed to a bottom-up perspective. And I think it stood me very well in the challenges that I would meet in the future when conducting operations like at planning for Desert Storm, when being the Joint Task Force Commander for Northern Watch, when first putting together operations in Afghanistan, Enduring Freedom, and looking at the whole picture. So I very much valued my education at the University of Virginia.
You know, the former Secretary of the Air Force, Jim Roach, said many times that systems engineering was the most critical deficiency in the Air Force under his tenure. That's what he lacked. That skill was atrophying within the Air Force. Sequestration is almost a textbook case of systems engineering. What's your take on what are the prospects of this happening, and or what could the impacts be?
Well, sequestration's in the law. As you know, it was a part of the Budget Control Act of 2011, then it was modified in 2012, and we felt the consequences in 2013. The bottom line is sequestration was designed to be so stupid that the Congress of the United States would not impose it. So it was a threat that was held over the combined committee to come up with $1.2 trillion in savings to reduce the deficit. And if they could not come up with a plan, then sequestration would automatically go into effect, which means that you have arbitrary cuts across all of the programs in both defense and non-defense discretionary funding. All right, now non-discretionary money, Social Security,
Medicare,
federal pensions. That's not part of this. Right. The other part where Defense of America gets the shaft is 50% of the sequestration cuts go to defense, then 50% go to non-defense discretionary spending, when in fact the Department of Defense budget only makes up 20% of the U.S. federal budget.
But 50% of the discretionary budget.
Doesn't matter. It's not right. You don't take 50% of the savings out of the organization that only gets 20% of the total budget. But be that as it may, what sequestration does is as damaging. A matter of fact, what Congress did to our Air Force is what the most capable enemies of the United States could only hope to achieve. In 2013, they shut down over 30 fighter squadrons, combat squadrons, not just fighter squadrons, but combat squadrons in the Air Force. They shut down our major readiness exercise, Red Flag. They shut down our graduate schools for our combat pilots. Could you imagine if we shut down all the graduate schools in the United States of America for a year? What that would do to the people that were scheduled to go to school during that time frame? We'll never get that competency back.
And the people that were going to hire them when they came out of those schools.
And we're still trying to recover from the readiness impact. And so what sequestration does is it forces the Department of Defense to cut the same amount from its highest priority programs as it does from its lowest priority programs. It forces the Department of Defense to take money out of modernization. I talked about you have a geriatric Air Force. You take money out of modernization in order to fund readiness. The problem with readiness is the United States of America, and particularly relies on our Air Force to be the first response force. We maintain our forces to be 100% ready all the time because we're not impacted by the tyranny of distance like the Navy or our surface forces are. That's just a fact of physics. Right. You know, they travel at 20 knots, we travel at 600 knots. So that's why you want a ready Air Force. But if you start impacting that readiness, we can't provide the initial protection that allows our naval and ground forces to get into position to react in a contingency. So sequestration is doing an immense amount of harm on not just the Air Force, but each one of our services. And each one of the service chiefs and the Secretary of Defense are adamantly opposed to it. And we need to lift it because it is a stupid way to do business. And our collective government needs to be smarter than that.
Yeah, in your crystal ball, your tea leaves, do you have any sense as to what the resolution here is going to be? Because it wasn't just $1.2 trillion worth of savings. It was $1.2 trillion worth of deficit reduction that could be done by either revenue increases or by program cuts.
Well, I think we need to continue to make the case with the members of Congress to get them to understand, in the case of readiness, readiness does not have a constituency until the people of the United States of America need it. Then it's too late. You know, do we want to risk the blood of America's sons and daughters in some future conflict, which we know we're going to have, by them not being ready?
But on the other hand, Admiral Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said the number one threat facing America is debt. Well,
let me give you a dramatic example. We can get rid of the entire U.S. Department of Defense and not solve our debt problem. So where is the issue? Where does it really lie? It lies with entitlements and with social programs that are nice to have, but they're not need to have. Nor are they stipulated as such in the Constitution of the United States of America.
But you could also flip that and say you could cut all the social programs and you still would not cut the deficit because, as you just were saying, the non-defense discretionary is roughly equal to defense, the discretionary budget.
That speaks to the challenge that we have ahead, doesn't it?
Well, because...
Which then gets us to, you ask me, well, what's the solution? I'll tell you what a solution is: term limits.
Well,
term limits is a solution because then that will get our elected officials to stop worrying about making irrational decisions from a national perspective, but very rational decisions from a re-election perspective.
I think a third of the U.S. House has turned over in the past like 6 years. There is this, we do have term limits to an extent because we have an election every 2 years. And we have been throwing people out. There has been a churn.
Yeah, but, no, I hear you, but that's an interesting discussion topic. But again, if I know as a congressman or woman that I'm leaving in 4 years, I'm going to make decisions not on the basis of having to get elected, but what's best for the nation.
Let's, we could have this conversation, but I think we need to have a bottle of scotch with that. We had a chart on total military spending. Can Can we throw that one up there? One of the sophomoric arguments is that the U.S. spends more on the military than the rest of the world combined. You hear that a lot. What's your take on it, and what's your response?
I think it is a really silly and sophomoric comparison, because none of those next 17 nations have the same degree of responsibility, authority, or capability to secure peace and stability around the world that the United States has as a burden, if you will, on its shoulders. So if we want to, if the metric is the kinds of spending so that we can be in line with the next 16 nations, then we're going to have to revise our national security strategy as such. And I don't think that's what the people in the United States nor those next 17 nations want. So it really is a non sequitur. Yes, a military is expensive, but I would like to make the point and remind you that the only thing more expensive than a first-rate Air Force is a second-rate Air Force. And we need to take that into consideration, not just apply to our Air Force, but if we want to maintain our position as the world's sole superpower, we need to have the strongest Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps in the world.
Now, the Air Force is asking for money, or as forecasted money, for both a new bomber and a new fighter to eventually replace the F-22.
And a new tanker.
And a new tanker.
Right.
At some point, at these price tags, don't we break the bank?
No, we don't break the bank, because we have to stop thinking about cost per aircraft and start thinking about cost per desired outcome or cost per desired effect. And at some point, I go back to using that, all right, if you wanted to have B-17s flying over Baghdad in 1991, what do you think their effectiveness would have been? So we have to be careful about, let's buy aircraft X because it's cheaper than aircraft Y. Well, it doesn't matter if aircraft X, when you first employ them in battle, all get shot down the first day of the war.
And can't adapt to the new battle.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Actually, after we go off the air, David and I are going to sit here and we're going to keep going back and forth on this conversation because it is a fascinating conversation. I'm Jeff Barnett. You've been watching The Inside Scoop. We're here with Lieutenant General retired David Deptula, former A2 or the Intelligence Surveillance Reconnaissance Chief for the Air Force, F-15 pilot, and a longtime resident of Fairfax.